Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Hobby Workshop, and this is part 2 in my giant Trench Crusade game board. If you did not check out part 1, be sure to go do that, because in that video, I went all over how modular this entire game board is. All these pieces can be moved around for each and every scenario. I also went over the basic fabrication of the trenches and the baseboard. In this part 2 video, it's all about detailing. So we're going to detail the concrete, the soil. I'm going to teach you how to texture, hand paint, and add some awesome water effects to really bring this board to life. And if you're enjoying this content, be sure to hit that subscribe button and come back for part 3, where I'm going to be making additional accessories for the board. Some of these are going to be 3D printed and manipulated to match classic concept art. Others are going to be completely of my own design. But before all that, we've got a lot to do, so let's get started. Preparing to add the ground cover, I'm going to protect my work surface with some plastic sheeting. For this process, I'm going to use a mixing bowl, a strainer, and some beige unsanded grout. But to the grout, I'm going to add some of my own very fine sand. For additional texture, I'm going to add 2 different sizes of stones. Placing these in layers, I'm going to do large stones, small stones, and then sift on a thin layer of grout. This is going to be saturated with a mixture of 2 parts distilled water to 1 part IPA. And to help lock in those stones, I have another mixture of 3 parts distilled water to 1 part PVA glue. Then another layer of grout can be applied on top selectively. Any additional PVA glue mixture can then be mopped up with a damp paper towel. This process can then be repeated for all the terrain pieces. And one thing to note is that I did not add a ton of the rocks to the bottoms of the craters, since they're going to be filled with a resin later on. But if you wanted to, you could also add some skulls or boards to the surface, and the PVA glue would fix those into place as well. And I know it seems like a lot of work, but once painted, all these textures are going to give the soiled surface a lot of visual interest, and push the believability of these pieces from even a game board to almost a diorama. And even though it seems like a lot of surface area, I bought a 10-pound bag of grout and I have a bunch left over, which is great because I'm going to use it for some 3D prints later on. Now for the baseboards underneath, I didn't add the stones to those, but I did add the grout mixture. This will break up the surface and give it a little more variety. I left my grout and stone mixtures to thoroughly dry overnight, and now I want to start applying washes to the surface. But before I do that, I want to seal the grout because I don't want it to absorb too much of the paint. I want the washes to flow down into the recesses and leave highlights. So to do that, I'm going to be using one of my costuming tricks, some quick shine floor polish. This is going to help seal the surface, and so the paint is going to flow down into the craters and around all the stones. Rather than painting on the floor polish, I load up the brush and I allow the grout to absorb the liquid. This will allow it to evenly soak into the surface and prevent pooling. If too much polish does build up, I would recommend to wick it away with a paper towel. Otherwise, after it dries, it could cause hazing. And here's a great example of the capillary action of the grout absorbing the polish. After all the pieces have been allowed to dry, I'm going to take this one step further and add a light dusting of Valspar gloss. This will help seal the surface even better for the washes, but the more red mud, which is the silicone showing through, will have a nice gloss treatment. Now, gloss spray does smell terrible, so I would definitely recommend to wear your respirator and work in a well-ventilated area. Here I have my garage door up and I'm blowing the fumes out. And look at all the awesome colors and textures that I've got going on, and this is even before hand painting. The wash I'm going to apply is going to be made up of a bunch of different colors because mud in itself is not just brown. So I'm going to be using some Liquitex Heavy Body, Mars Black, Burnt Sienna, Red Oxide, Chromium Oxide Green, and Dioxazine Purple. These colors when combined give a very dark, rich brown that's heavily saturated. So utilizing a lot of water, the wash is painted over the entire surface. I'll then go back with a damp paper towel to mop up some of the excess paint. And every time I apply the wash to the trench sections, I'm pulling from a different part of the plate. That way I'm getting different variations from each one of those colors that's involved. So certain sections of the trenches may have more of a reddish tone or more of a purplish tone, but they're all working together in that same value range. And on this large no man's land area, you can definitely see those different color hues that are being applied. Now at this point it does darken up the soil quite a bit, but it's alright because I'm going to go back with a dry brush highlight later on. The wash was also applied to the baseboards to darken up the grout that's on those surfaces as well. Now I'm going to add some water effects to the craters later on, but to simulate a good amount of depth, I'm going to water down some Liquitex Heavy Body Mars Black. This paint will be applied to the bottom of each crater or depression and then feathered up to give it a gradual look. With my main soil sections now base coated, but before I get into the dry brushing and detailing, I want to go back and work on the ones that I want to look like concrete. That way, when I add the additional dry brushing, detailing, and washes, I can do that to all of the sections so the entire game board has one harmonious tone. To give the impression of some assembled concrete slabs, a hobby knife is used to score the insulation foam. Then a pencil will be used to open up that scored line. For detailing and texturing the surface, I'm going to roll around a crumpled up foil ball. And to simulate cracks, the hobby blade and bamboo skewers are used to distress the surface. After the battle damage is applied, I can't use self-etching primer because it will eat the foam. So I paint on a watered down layer of Liquitex Heavy Body Mars Black. After the paint had been allowed to dry, I then applied the PVA and distilled water mixture to the surface. The dry grout was then sifted onto the glue. The powder was then heavily sprayed with a mixture of distilled water and isopropyl alcohol. A foam brush can then be used to make sure that all of the dry powder is saturated. To give some variation to the surface, after using the foam brush, I then dabbed the surface with a damp paper towel. Before the grout had a chance to fully cure, I went back in and re-scribed all of my panel lines. Now at this point, the grout will still absorb liquids, so you could easily apply washes of acrylics or inks to tint the surface. The PVA mixture is once again painted onto the surface using a filbert brush. Now notice here that I'm trying to steer clear of adding too much grout to the damaged areas. It is possible that you could overflood these areas and destroy the detail. To coat the sides of this piece, the grout is combined with the PVA mixture on my painting palette. This could then be brushed onto the surface, and again I'm making sure not to fill in the damaged cracks that I applied earlier. A hairdryer can always be used to speed up the dry time, and I did take pictures of it in this wet concrete stage so I could replicate this look with acrylic washes at some point. Now I'd like to add some 3D printed elements to the board. First things first, I need to print off the model on my Bamboo X1 carbon. This bunker file is from Diceverse over on My Mini Factory. I assembled the front gate using some Bob Smith superglue with a little bit of accelerator. The top plate can then be attached, and I like the fact that this is removable for gameplay. The cross comes in two halves, and then it can be attached to the top of the spire. Now I'm making at least two bunkers, one for the Christians and one for the heretics. The heretic version, the spire is going to be broken, so I need to cut it down. To fill the gaps on the infill, I'm using some 2-part epoxy sculpt. Once the two halves are mixed together, they can be applied and then sculpted with various sculpting tools and smoothed out with water. Now like I had mentioned, I'm not going to sand the print before adding the mixture, but I do want to go in and fill the gaps to at least make it look seamless. So I'm going to roll out some thin tubes of epoxy sculpt and then press those into place. Switching over to a dampened silicone tip tool, I can move the epoxy sculpt around and better match the surface textures. The two bunkers can then be left to cure. With the epoxy cured, I can now attach the spires to the top. Now there is a decent gap all the way around, and to fill this I'm going to use the trick of baking soda and superglue. Once these two elements have been combined, it creates a chemical reaction. The baking soda turns into a cement and becomes very hard. Any excess can then be brushed away, leaving just the hardened powder. And if you need to, pin files can be used to sand the baking soda down. The spire for the other bunker can then be attached to the top, and the process can be repeated. Now I could have also filled this gap with additional epoxy sculpt, but in case you didn't know about it, I wanted to share this technique with you as well. Now it's time to make our stone/concrete facade. I'm going to start off with some Maipe beige unsanded grout, but with a little bit of very fine sand added. Now grout has been used in dioramas for a very long time, but not on 3D prints because it usually rubs off, but I figured out a solution to that. To this, I'm going to add some of my 3:1 distilled water to PVA glue mixture, along with a little bit of distilled water. Using a slightly larger cup, I'm going to add more of the powdered grout, and to this I'm going to pour in some, but not all of our mixture. By keeping these separate, it allows me to control the consistency of the grout. Now the key to getting this to stick to the print is spraying on some Rust-Oleum self-etching primer. This will prep the surface and give our mixture something to hold on to. And here you can see how the consistency is similar to a watery oatmeal. Before the mixture is applied to the surface, I paint on some of the PVA and distilled water mix. Then using my brush, I dab on the grout mixture as my first coat. After the side had been covered, I'll then take some dry grout and sift it on top. The powder was then heavily sprayed with a mixture of distilled water and isopropyl alcohol, the ratio of that being 3 parts water to 1 part iso. After the area had been thoroughly soaked, I'll then use a foam brush, pressing any of the dry powder into the moisture. I'll then continue to work my way around the outside of the bunker until the entire surface had been coated. Because the top is removable, I'll also paint the interior. Now while you're painting on the PVA mixture and the grout mixture, you'll notice that the bristles on your brush will start to flare. That's just an excess accumulation of sand and grout near the ferrule. So make sure to have a small container to the side that you can continually rinse your brush out in. Before I forget, one thing to note is that grout can contain silica, so make sure you're wearing gloves and a respirator. Now with areas that are more vertical, you may need to change the consistency of the grout mixture. You can do this by adding additional dry powders into your mixing cup. But if the consistency is good, just keep working your way around the piece. Now the cool thing about grout is that it does come in a variety of different colors, so you could easily change the entire look of a piece depending on what colors you want to use. To help speed along the dry times, I use a hair dryer on high, and you can see how it lightens up the material quite a bit. And this is just after one layer. I'm already starting to get some really cool textures. Now if you need to, a second layer can be applied on top. In this case, without covering the entire surface, I went back to certain areas that just appeared to be a little too light. Using some 400 grit sandpaper, I went ahead and knocked down some of the heavier grains, but as an added bonus, this also helps edge highlight. And here you can see with just a little bit of sanding how much it changes the look of the piece. And just like the concrete slabs, I want to add additional washes to these as well later on. Now I'm going to make up a dry brush layer as a highlight, using Liquitex Heavy Body Chromium Oxide Green, Burnt Sienna, Neutral Gray Value 5, and Mars Black. And notice how some of these are colors that I used in the wash earlier. That way I'm not diverting too far from the same color value. This paint is applied with a mop brush using no water. I only want to highlight the peaks, leaving the dark recesses of the craters alone. Alright, so people from my prop and costume page know that I love paints and I love my layers, and I'm obsessing over the details on this project, but in a good way. So I'm going to water down some of that brown highlight with the neutral gray, and grabbing my detail brush, I'm going to start to pick out individual rocks on the surface. Contrasting with that brown, this is a fantastic way to add dimension to the piece. Now you don't have to paint all of the rocks, just paint some of them and then back the piece off 2 to 3 feet. I'll even squint my eyes some to blur the image. That way I'm not seeing individual details. I'm looking at the piece as a whole and seeing where additional highlights may need to go. And this shot is a fantastic before and after. In the beginning, you see the mound itself is pretty brown, but after those individual rocks are picked out, you can see how much more life it gives to the surface. Using some UV resin and transparent acrylic inks, I'm going to ramp up the believability of our board by adding some water effects. The resin is poured into a cup and just a few drops of each color are added, and this is using raw sienna, burnt sienna, and muted green. Because this battlefield is more fantasy-based, I wanted the water to appear foul and stagnant, so the sickly off-tone green I think works great with the brown. The first step is to pour some of the resin into the deepest craters. I'll then use a tongue depressor to even out the surface. A heat gun is then applied to the liquid resin, and this is going to pop any of the air bubbles. Then a UV light can be held over the surface until the resin is cured. So with this resin I work in small batches, and I'm trying to keep the water height at approximately the same depth throughout the battlefield. But if you wanted these deeper, I would recommend to cure the resin in multiple layers versus one straight pour, so you don't run the risk of having uncured resin underneath. That way the UV light has an opportunity to cure each layer on its own, and then you can add more. To simulate a wet or rainy surface, I'm going to use a chip brush to stipple on the resin, but I'd also recommend to have some tweezers nearby to pick up any loose fibers, which are bound to happen. The resin is drawn out and thinly put on the plate. Then after the bristles are saturated, I'll aggressively stipple the surface. This is visually a better process than applying gloss to the entire surface, because some of those areas that are still matte are showing through, which is what happens in the real world. Air is going to dry out certain types of dirt quicker, depending on how many rocks or how much clay is mixed in. Now obviously I'm adding a ton of detail to these sections, but that's how I enjoy this process. Even if you're following along and you're inspired by this, don't feel you have to do all the steps that I do. Make the board yours and unique to you. Now the only downside to the stippling is that it added more texture to the water in the craters than I would have liked. But it's a very simple fix. All I have to do is put a little bit of that resin back on top. But as you can see here, after the resin cures, it smooths out that top coat and our pools are once again clear. And it does such a great job you can even still see some of the rocks at the bottom, so you could even add additional miniature bits or skulls to your piece. With all of my resin water effects complete, I do need to tidy up the back sides to my no man's land. I'm going to paint the poster board with a couple of layers of heavy body Mars Black. That way the pieces just look more professional and finished, especially if they're on the edge of a table. I want to thank the sponsor of today's video, Goblin'sHut.com, the supplier of Dirty Down sprays which I use on a bunch of my props, and the liquids which I'll be using on this build. Make sure to thoroughly shake the bottles to get the chemicals mixed, or use one of these bottle shakers. I paint the mixture over the plaster areas that I had applied in the Part 1 video. This works great for the application because the lighter plaster really sells that oxidation effect. Now with the Dirty Down rust, you can just let it air dry, or you can use a hairdryer to speed up that dry time. I opted for the hairdryer because sometimes I'd want to build up multiple layers of pigment. But these pieces are starting to come together, and I'm loving the different textures that I have going on. Between the water effects and textures on the soil, and the matte rust on this corrugated metal, visually all these elements are going to add to the believability of the board. So I hope you all enjoyed this part 2 tutorial furthering the detail of this giant Trench Crusade game board. And like I had mentioned in the beginning, be sure to swing back by for part 3, where I'm going to be making additional accessories to flush this board out and really bring it to life. And if you're interested in following the day-to-days on it, be sure to follow my Instagram at SKS Hobby Workshop.